Hello, everyone, and welcome back for Season 5 of Lush Life. We begin this season with an author, a speaker, a liveryman at the Worshipful Company of Distillers, a keeper of the Quaich, and most of all, a champion of whiskey. I'm Susan Schwartz, your drinking companion, and this is Lush Life Podcast. Every week, we're inspired to live life one cocktail at a time. Eddie Ludlow is all of those things I described and more. He founded the Whisky Lounge, which has been introducing whiskey to the world for over 10 years, and has just published his first book, Whiskey, a Tasting Course. Whether you're a beginner to whiskey or a pro, there is no way you can't learn something from his book. Everything about it makes you want to pick up that bottle and serve yourself a dram right now. Unfortunately, due to recent circumstances, the Whisky Lounge has had to cancel their in-real-life tastings. But that hasn't stopped them from planning a virtual festival, their Whiskey Festival in a Box, from October 16th to 18th. Eddie will tell you all about how to sign up later on in the show. Drams ready? Let's go. I am so excited to have you on the show. I am sitting here with 3 fabulous whiskeys in front of me, and I have been longing to talk to you after reading your book, a fabulous book. So thank you so much for being on the show.
That's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely. So I want to know everything because you have titles that I don't even know how to pronounce, and I want to know how you got those. So let's start with kind of how you fell into whiskey. I'll probably interrupt and ask you a million questions along the way, but how did you even decide that you wanted to be in the spirits industry?
I'm not sure whether it was me that chose whiskey or whiskey that chose me, to be honest. I went to college in a place called Newcastle upon Tyne. I went to art college for 1 year. And then I decided that even drawing was too much like hard work, so I did a music course for 2 years after that. And then found at the end of the course that I'd learned quite a bit, but I realized that my options were limited as a professional musician. I enjoyed playing with my blues band, but I couldn't see myself as a teacher or a session musician. Kind of compromising my musical taste, which a lot of people have to do in order to make a living out of music.
What did you play? What instrument?
Well, I did, and I still do play guitar. I don't play as much as I used to, obviously, but I still enjoy playing now and again. It just suddenly hit me. Oh my God, what am I going to do? I've learned to draw and play guitar, but I've learned very little apart from life skills. So I went home almost with my tail between my legs, back down to the southeast of England, worked in a pub for 6 to 9 months, I think it was. Learned a bit about beer and beer making, because the landlord there was very, very into his real ale, way before the current, I'm not going to call it a fad, it's a genuine enthusiasm for real ale now in this country and elsewhere. But this was way before that. And it just fascinated me that someone would be so into alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
That it wasn't just about getting loaded. It was actually, there was something a lot more behind it all. And he used to sort of drag me into the cellar and say, look, try this one. I've had this one laying for a week or so, and taste how different it is now. And it was just his sort of pure enthusiasm, which became kind of infectious, I guess. And so I kind of continued with that. And my dad as well, he's not into whiskey, but he's into wine. He won't thank me for once. He was having dinner. We were having dinner once, and it was before I was drinking, but he was drinking a white wine, and he said, "Oh, could you get me some more of that delicious Chablis from the fridge?" I think And I looked at the open bottle of wine in the fridge, and it was English white wine, And at the time, this is when English wine was not the English wine of now. This is back in the 90s when the English still wine was perhaps not the best.
No award winning.
But he's never lived it down that he couldn't tell the difference between an English table wine and a Chablis. But it all kind of contributed to my very early education in alcoholic products. And so after my experience in the pub, I ended up moving back to Newcastle upon Tyne because it's weird. I got reverse homesick because I loved it so much up there, and I missed all my friends from the college days, and most of the guys from college lived in the Toon. So I moved back. I trod the streets looking for work. I literally just by that point just needed a job, and so I walked past a branch of Oddbins, the old wine merchant, and saw that they had an advert in the window looking for a van driver stroke sales assistant. So I wandered in. I had my guitar on my back and my ponytail in behind me.
I love it.
I must have looked a bit of a sight. And I went in and said to them, I'm looking for a job. This sounds like something I could do. How about it? And
I kind of want to say, and the rest is history.
And the rest is exactly. Yeah. There's obviously a lot more history to it, but that's how it all began. But I needed 2 interviews to get this job. It wasn't easy. I remember I had to sell them a bottle of beer because I knew nothing about wine at that point. But I knew a little bit about beer, and they had a beer. I remember the beer was Hopback Summer Lightning, and I had to describe the beer to them and really sell it to them as if it was a new car or something, which tickled me. I thought, well, yeah, this could be quite cool.
I love it. And so, selling wine is different from selling whiskey. When did you start, I guess, you're falling in love with whiskey, or even knowing, drinking whiskey, or knowing it was there, kind of?
Yeah, well, probably back in the pub days, because it was my dad's birthday, and I'd seen all the whiskies behind the bar, and I thought that most men like whiskey. Is that not a thing? Back in the bad days, and so my boss, the landlord there, I remember he recommended I get him a bottle of Macallan 10-year-old. I remember looking at the bottle and thinking, that's not an unattractive item, is it? That looks really good. So I ended up buying him a bottle. I don't remember what happened to the bottle. I suspect probably my dad's friends drank it for him, because I don't think he would have done. But that was my first experience, I suppose, with single malt whiskey. But certainly, in Oddbins back in the day, it was almost as much a whiskey specialist as a wine specialist, and particularly the further north you got in the country. So the branch that I worked at, Newcastle upon Tyne City Centre, was one of the biggest selling Scotch whiskey and particularly single malt whiskey branches in the UK. So we had access to all the really good stuff. And it breaks my heart actually to think back to some of the stuff we had in the mid to late 90s, which seemed expensive at the time but was dirty cheap, really. And I can still remember a lot of the prices that were drilled into my head. And I kind of wish I could go back in time and
I'm sure
with a fresh credit card and just buy
and snap up all of those.
Oh, it's incredible. You couldn't give it away then. In the 90s, people were, there were 1 or 2 people who were in the know and were very savvy and bought a lot of stuff. Some people drank it as well. But generally speaking, whiskey was not in the same state as it is now.
No, people were drinking Cosmos, and Caipirinhas were just happening, or they were to us, at least when I live in New York. All of a sudden, I remember the 90s, no one ever mentioned an old fashioned.
Oh, well, in Newcastle upon Tyne, they wouldn't at that stage have been drinking caipirinhas. It was more vodka and Red Bull and 2020 and the cider and black currant. Really height of sophistication.
And when did you start drinking it and I guess teaching yourself or giving yourself that whiskey education?
Well, it was in Oddbins. I had two Scottish bosses.
That's it.
Yeah, exactly. A manager and an assistant manager. Plus, we had a team of sales assistants, most of whom were probably older than me, who had quite a lot of experience in wine and whiskey tastings. And I think because of my artistic background, I became kind of the shop artist, and I would do all the labels for the bottles. And I don't know if you remember Oddbins of old, but there used to be really lovely kind of handwritten descriptive labels for all the wine, all the whiskey, everything. So you could really, if you went in and you didn't speak to someone, you could easily select something just by these lovely descriptors. And so I think it was when I was writing the descriptors for the whiskies, and I became more and more fascinated in it. And I think the whole Ralph Steadman connection was I found really powerful as well, because he did I think it was called Life in Still Motion or something like that. It's a book of his illustrations of Scottish distilleries. And it's beautiful, and they're really lovely, and that kind of had an influence on me as well. So I think I just became more and more fascinated by the look of it, and then the taste of it. I started we had a lot of bottles open that we would be given by, I guess Oddbins would be given by distillers in order to help customers make their selections. And so we'd have, at any one time, we would have 50, 60 bottles open. And
fantastic. That's amazing.
And to this day, I would say to anyone who is whiskey curious that they should always shop in an independent specialist, because a lot of those, the independent specialists now are run by people who work for Oddbins or similar companies who've then gone on to, do their own thing. And they've learned from that, and they've learned that the most powerful tool for selling is to be able to taste.
Of course.
There's no substitute for that. And you can't generally do that in a supermarket. It's a fairly, anemic experience, and you don't get to chat with people who really care about the product. So I would always say go to a specialist if you can. Mm-hmm. It's obviously a little bit more challenging at the moment with the current circumstances, but there are specialists out there who will actually send small samples, so you don't have to invest in a full bottle to begin with, which is a great idea as well.
It's a fantastic idea. And so you became, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the best seller of whiskey in that Oddbins for the whole of the UK, or at that time.
Yeah, certainly that shop and our team was known as we were the biggest seller of single malt whiskey in England in Oddbins. There was a couple of stores in Scotland that sold more, but not many of them. And then I decided to start visiting Scotland and visiting the distilleries myself, and that's really, I guess, where I got really set off, because I'm sure you've been to one or two distilleries in your time. There's no substitute for going where the stuff is made, and tasting it with the people that make it, whilst they're telling you how they do it.
Especially in Scotland, where it's so romantic, and you just get caught up in the stories as well. I'm a storyteller, story fan, and so that just gobsmacks me every time I go to one.
Yeah.
The liquid is fabulous, obviously, but combined with the history, the story, the place, it just can. You can fall in love with it. It can get into your blood. It can obsess you. Absolutely. So when did you think it was time to move on from Odd Bins and then become, I guess,
Well,
the brand ambassador to
yeah.
a few of these?
Well, I spent a few years in that shop in Newcastle. I started doing whiskey tastings because they had already started doing wine tastings outside of business hours for customers. So I said, well, why shouldn't we start doing whiskey tastings on a similar basis? So that's really how it started, I guess. Once I'd started going back and forth to Scotland, and then I would move around the country from store to store as a manager, just exploring new areas. I would start my little whiskey tasting club in each of those areas, and and from there I moved to York, which is where I still live. And I got a call from one of the older managers of the shop I was running in York, saying, "Oh, there's a recruitment company who might be in touch with you because there's a role that they've heard of that they think might be right up your street." And so this recruitment agency called me up and said, this business is looking for someone, someone to be a whiskey ambassador for one of their brands. Would you be interested? And, I'd kind of done as much as I'd wanted to with Oddbins. Similarly to my musical career, I'd kind of taken it to the point where, yes, I could maybe have gone on and done area management or some desk jockey role, but what I enjoyed the most was talking to people face to face and really helping them along their journey. And I just didn't think I could do that anymore. So I leapt at the chance. So it was Moet Hennessy UK, and the brand at the time was a very niche blended Scotch whiskey called the Bailey Nickel Jarvie, which very sadly is no longer with us. They delisted it. They stopped making it because it just wasn't, I don't think it sat within their kind of luxury portfolio so well. So, and they didn't really know what to do with it. But fortunately for me, when I was working for them, they also distribute and own Ardbeg and Glenmorangie, which two of my favorite single malt whiskies. So I kind of said, well, look, if I'm talking about this, surely it makes sense for me to talk about these guys as well. And so I soon kind of transmogrified my role from being for one whiskey to being three very, very good whiskies. And I did that for a couple of years.
And were you going all around the country and just introducing people to the whiskeys that are, Ardbeg and Glenmorangie? And
so I would do. So it would range from representing them in whiskey festivals, ironically, doing tastings for hotels and sommeliers, and it was, and also training the staff within Moet Hennessy itself, because by their own admission, they were very much wine and champagne orientated. They knew a bit about cognac because of Hennessy, obviously, but they didn't really know about whiskey. So it was my role to train the UK sales staff in the ways of whiskey and how it should be presented.
Well, I know in my limited knowledge of whiskey, Glenmorangie, which I'm looking at right now, is one that I guess most people have heard of. Ardbeg, maybe not so much, at least unless you're maybe a diehard, really peaty whiskey fan. Did you find that, again, excuse my ignorance on whiskey, but how did you find, during the time that you were there that people responded to the two whiskeys? Was it surprising to you, or was it teaching people things that they already knew?
It would vary incredibly because obviously, certain parts of the country tend to be ahead of other parts of the country in terms of their evolution, drinks wise, food wise, and so on. So, London, almost out of necessity, is always well ahead of pretty much anywhere else in the UK. So it would really vary a lot, and I would be surprised sometimes because you would think most people would prefer Glenmorangie, and probably that was the case. But then there would be the occasional, and I remember actually a couple of females who would be on the tasting and would actually prefer the Ardbeg to the Glenmorangie, even though they would never, they confessed to never having really tasted whiskey before. And I think that's because when you taste them side by side, because they are so, diametrically opposed style-wise, it's almost like two different categories of spirit rather than two different whiskies. And so if you have that affinity with something smoky, forget about the whiskey aspect of it, then you can kind of understand how that might be attractive to somebody. So yeah, I would definitely have the odd surprise.
Yeah, I think my first whiskey was I had a grandmother who loved single malt. And so I think the first thing she ever gave me was something very peaty.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, that is really like if I'm sitting down to have a whiskey, a dram, that is what I would reach for. It kind of feels like you're having a little illicit cigarette, even though I've never smoked or ever wanted to smoke. We're talking pre the new cocktail renaissance where kind of everyone is drinking bourbon and whiskeys now. So it's not surprising that people might not have been so in tune with the specifics of each whiskey.
Yeah. I mean, it's true to say that we started the York Whiskey Festival back in 2001, 2002. I'm always very hazy. Some people insist it's 2001, but I just don't think I can remember past 2002. And then we started the full-time business in 2008, which is, I finished with Moet Hennessy in 2007. And, I think back to those days, and they feel like very innocent days when life was quite simple, and people didn't have the same level of knowledge, but at the same time, they perhaps didn't have the same level of preconception, and being very judgmental about things. And I think what we're at risk at the moment is people getting too bogged down in the minutiae of how a whiskey is made, and the casks it's been in, and whether the cask was emptied on a Thursday, and just kind of getting too obsessive with detail. And I think what I'd like to see people just do is just enjoy it. The stuff is being made for you to enjoy it. And yes, if part of that enjoyment for you is the detail, fine, but don't let that get in the way of you just kicking back with a friend and just enjoying the stuff.
Mm-hmm. So were you ready to talk about all different kinds of whiskeys when you created the Whisky Lounge? I mean, were you like, oh, okay, you've been talking about, 2 or 3 for Moet Hennessy for so long. Now I get to talk about every single one that I want to the whole, wider world.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what you need to remember is that, yes, I was with Moet Hennessy for 2 years, but I was with Oddbins for a long time before that. So I had already a lot of exposure to a lot of different whiskies. And I kept that up through my Moet Hennessy days. I mean, yes, obviously my focus job-wise and professionally was those 3 whiskies, but I still had an interest and still, did a lot of research and reading about other whiskies, and actually as part of my role. So we would taste competitor whiskies at certain training sessions to give the sales guys a taste of the competition as they saw it. So yeah, I was more than prepared.
Yes, no, I'm sure you were very prepared. And why did you even decide to leave and start the Whisky Lounge?
In all honesty, well, there was a couple of reasons. One, and this might sound really ungrateful, but I didn't enjoy the job as much as I thought I would, and I didn't feel that I fitted into the corporate world. There was a lot of great people there, and still are, and all credit to them for sticking it out. But equally, there was a lot of people who are just ladder climbing, and you could have been working with any product. It didn't, it would. And so for me, I'm all in. If I'm working for you, or I'm working for myself, I need to be focused, and I need to be passionate about what I'm selling, what I'm doing. And if I'm not, then I'm not going to give it 100%. And I just,
you know what? I hear that a lot. Actually, I've heard that quite a bit from a few brand ambassadors.
Mhm.
That they're out there. A lot of them who've come from the bar world, bartending. They're all of a sudden stuck in a corporate job where they're not able to have that, what they get from the bar, what they get from chatting to people all the time in their role,
yeah,
and it makes them unhappy, and they
yeah,
want to go back.
exactly. And for them, as it was for me, I'm sure it's also challenging to not be able to talk about all brands,
Right.
because that's not your role. You're paid to talk about the brands that your company is associated with. Now, there are one or two brand ambassadors who are very successful, and I take my hat off to them, who have managed to carve out their role for years and years, and work around it, and do talk about other brands, and they're allowed to talk about other brands, which is I think a very powerful thing. But they are, I think, the in the minority. I think most brand ambassadors have a lifespan, probably 2 to 3 years, before they burn out from either.
I've heard anywhere from 2 to 3 to 9.
Oh, really?
Someone said I could only be a brand ambassador for 9 years. I knew into the 10th, I just couldn't do it. So
9 years. Well, that's hats off to them.
I know, and they were international. But so when you had, okay, I'm going to do the Whisky Lounge. It's kind of, what were your first steps, and how did you see it grow?
The first steps were really that Amanda, my wife, and we would talk about, obviously, work and play and whatever else, and this is even before we were married, and it kind of got to the stage with Moet Hennessy where I was just getting really hacked off with it all, and I didn't really know what to do about it. And I even considered applying for a global ambassador's role with Glenmorangie, which a very good friend of mine who works in Glenmorangie, quite high up, so I won't mention his name, actually talked me out of, because he said to me, if you do that, you'll risk your family life, because you'll be away so much,
right,
that it could have a very detrimental effect on your family. And we just had our daughter at the time. So I didn't go for it, and I'm very pleased I didn't go for it, even though I'm sure it would have been great fun to travel the world. And so we were talking, Amanda and I, about what I could do, and we already had the York Whiskey Festival kind of still on the go, and she basically talked me into the fact that this business, which wasn't yet called Whisky Lounge, but it was obviously before it started, it was, that this could be a business for me. And it was a kind of serendipitous moment in the autumn of 2017, where I was called into the office, in the London office, and they said, we're really sorry, we're going to have to make you redundant.
Oh.
And it's weird, because I had this kind of almost like a dream the night before this, about that I was going to leave and I was going to start my own business. And so I think they were expecting my reaction to be, oh no, and upset and so on. And actually my reaction was, oh, Okay.
This is the moment of my dreams.
Yeah, I feel very lucky because obviously most people who put in
Yeah.
that position are it's a disaster. I mean, they offered to keep me on my on the same wages as a sales guy. That's just not for me.
Mhm.
Uh, I'll take my redundancy, thank you very much. And I started the Whisky Lounge 3 months later.
And did you see, were people receptive to it right away?
Yeah, generally speaking, yes. I mean, it was. I mean, again, if I think back to those early days, it was a far cry from now. Well, so in the first year, we had the York Whisky Festival, and I started doing tastings around the country. So in London, Brighton, um, Lancaster, other places, basically within pubs where I'd made their acquaintance during my years with my Hennessy. And it was just me driving my beaten up old car with a bunch of whiskey and glasses in the back, almost like a traveling salesman, but not. And I would, occasionally I would stay away, but if I was in the deep south, but if I was not too far away, I'd drive home, and I'd be home sort of midnight or a bit later or something. I mean, it just became perfectly normal.
Mhm.
And then the following year, we started doing the Manchester and Newcastle whiskey festivals along with York, and they were a hit straight away because Newcastle, obviously, I had history with,
Yeah.
even though Oddbins was no more by that point. I think people already remembered me from my Oddbins days, so that didn't do me any harm, thankfully. And Manchester, I kind of identified as a real potentially strong area, and as it proved to be. And then the following year, we went from doing 3 festivals in 2009 to doing 5, I think, in 10, and then we were up to 8 and then 10 or something like that.
And did you see the audience for these change throughout the years, the 12 years that you've been doing them?
Oh, absolutely.
Mhm.
Absolutely. I mean, particularly when we started doing them further south, so in London and Brighton. I mean, the first year in Brighton was a real eye opener. I mean, I actually lived not too far from Brighton when I was a kid in Reigate in Surrey, which was about an hour's drive, I think, from Brighton. And but I didn't remember it being the way it was when we first went there with the Whiskey Festival. This very bohemian and vibrant city, which is completely bonkers in the most wonderful way. But so we we put this whiskey festival on in the Hilton in Brighton, which is this kind of network of function rooms. I mean, it's immense. I did get lost in there. I think there's customers still trying to find their way out. And but the customers we had come there it was just incredible. These young people. I remember a guy dressed in a pink tutu over jeans or something like that. And it was just wacky, but it was brilliant. And just seeing all these young people coming to enjoy whiskey. And it was just, yeah, it definitely illustrated quite early on that whiskey was about to go through quite a revolution in terms
And
of popularity.
seeing that revolution, was that when you thought, oh, you know what? These people really need a book, and I need to write this book.
No, it's not as simple as that. I've been meaning to write a book on the subject for years and years, and I've kind of come up with ideas, but never, brought them to life. I'd be super honest about this. I was very fortunate. I was contacted out of the blue by a publisher.
Fabulous.
And, not just any publisher, but DK, Penguin / Random House. Well, the story goes, actually, they sent an email through the website saying, we're trying to contact Eddie Ludlow about potentially writing this book for us. And so this email was forwarded to me. I read it, and my immediate reaction was, this has got to be a practical joke. This is my Geordie mate Connor's putting me to task. So I nearly replied, yeah, right. I didn't. So I replied and said, yeah, that sounds really interesting. And so then we had a phone call, and then I went for a meeting on the Strand, and yeah, I was very fortunate. They wanted a specific book, a guide to tasting whiskey as it is, and they wanted me to write it because I think they thought I was younger than I was.
No. They heard about you, I know. But I have to say, I have this book right here, and I devoured it.
Wow.
Literally in one day. It is so, number one, beautiful, and beautifully, not only beautifully written, but beautiful inside, and so accessible for anyone from a beginner, really for a beginner to even someone who knows a little bit to, I'm sure masters, because it just makes it so easy to understand. And I don't know, hopefully it was your idea to do I think it's the smartest thing to do you have 20 tastings of 4 specific types of whiskey at one sitting. And I think that's brilliant. It is just such a wonderful book. And was this the idea that you, after it was finished and during it, that was it your, conception to do it this way?
Yes, well, in consultation with the publisher, that's how we decided to format it, because we wanted to. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of whiskey books out there, and a lot of very good whiskey books out there, and fabulous whiskey writers. And to be honest, I was quite surprised they didn't ask one of those more established guys and gals. So when we were putting this together, we wanted it to have a point of difference. And the point of difference was going to be that it was a practical book, in which people could actually, taste along and see, using their own taste buds and olfactories, the difference between the whiskies. I mean, it was quite challenging in terms of choosing the whiskies, because
that was going to be my next question. How to choose when you have to choose, so you've chosen 4 times 20, 80 specific ones with obviously options underneath them.
Yeah. So
that must have been the hardest part.
Yeah, it probably was, actually. I think because I knew that it was potentially an international book, not just a UK edition, then I needed to consider, what was available globally. And yeah, I mean, it did my head in, to be honest. All the research I had to do in that regard, apart from anything else. I mean, I have heard that, you can't help but look at reviews on Amazon and whatever, and there's one on the US site which is a little bit unkind, I think, because the person writing it says that it's completely impossible to get hold of any of the whiskies, which I think is unfair.
You cannot believe an Amazon review. Don't you know that their TV show is about how they're liars? So don't worry about that.
I know, but you can't help it. And, I've been told stay off the Amazon reviews, but you can't help it. I'm lucky. Most of them have been really lovely. In fact, I had a message completely out of the blue. I hope you don't mind me mentioning this, but through Facebook saying, I hope you don't mind me messaging you. But I thought I'd let you know that I bought your book, and myself and a group of us have been going through all the lessons, one after the other, we've so far bought 45 of the whiskies from the book, and we are working our way meticulously through it. And it's none of us have been into whiskey before this, and our confidence has been built exponentially through each lesson. And it was just such a lovely thing for someone to say, and even just that makes it all worthwhile.
Oh, what a compliment. I know I was looking, I can't wait to start, actually. I'm going to start from the very beginning and go through it, because I love my bourbon, maybe because I'm an American, but, and so I've always wanted to learn more. And I was like, oh, I can't wait next week, to start. I don't have all of them, but, to make, to try and get some of them and try it.
Well, maybe we can do lesson 1 together.
Oh, that'd be fabulous.
Yeah.
We'll do it for the show.
Yeah.
But, I think you're being super modest when you said, I don't know why they came to me, when you have so many titles, in your bio, and ones that I don't even know how to pronounce, as I said. Now, please tell me how to pronounce the keeper of the
Quaich.
Quaich. I don't want to embarrass myself by trying to say it. And you are a member of many whiskey groups and guilds, and you are the man, really. You are one of the whiskey guys in this milieu. So, it's not surprising that DK came to you.
Yeah. It makes me feel very uncomfortable.
It's a very English thing to say.
I think I'm very fortunate to have been in the right place at the right time on many occasions. I am, extremely lucky, not just professionally, but in my personal life with my wife and children. And I think passion and determination and a strength of character can carry you through a lot of situations, and I think that's probably could be part of the reason I've got to doing all the wonderful things I have. But I would never ever address myself as a whiskey expert. It's really not. It's not something that I would be comfortable self-applying. I've heard other people applying wine expert or things like this to themselves, and I just cringe, because there's hundreds, if not thousands, of people out there that know far more than I do. I probably have a good broad range of knowledge on the subject, and for me the thing is communication. It's not necessarily how much you know, it's how you actually communicate that knowledge. And that's knowledge that's been entrusted, and it's almost like a respect thing. I respect whiskey, and I respect the people that make it, and I think it's important to convey that, and that people are able to enjoy it in the best way.
Absolutely. And it's for us to call you an expert. You don't have to call yourself an expert. We can call you an expert. So thank you so much for being on the show. I enjoyed so much talking to you, and I'm going to reread the book, and I can't wait for our tasting.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again for having me on. It's been, it's been really cool, and I don't get to tell those tales to too many people. So thanks for listening.
Of course.
Now
it
that
was
we
great
know
to
all
learn
about
it. Thank
Eddie,
you.
Here's how to join the Whiskey Festival in a box.
So obviously this year we can't be having the Whisky Lounge in real life, but you have thought of something super creative, and you're doing the Whiskey Festival in a box. So tell me a little bit about how that concept started, and what it is, and when it is, and all of that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, as you rightly point out, we're not able to bring our events physically to people in the venues that we normally would, and it's very challenging, because we're all social creatures, and for us, seeing people face to face, welcoming hundreds of people into these venues to enjoy whiskey is part of why we do it, and it's really heartbreaking not being able to do that. So the next best thing are virtual events. There's no getting around that. So we've thought long and hard about the best way of putting these events together. over the last few months, we've done a lot of virtual tastings with accompanying tasting packs so people can enjoy at home whilst we're doing presentations and chats and so on. And so that's where Whiskey Festival in a Box has come together. It's a knitting together, if you like, of different festival sessions which have different subject matters, each with their own accompanying tasting pack, which is very, very exciting. And I'm going to be presenting it from one of our local distilleries as well, out in lovely North Yorkshire coast, a place called Spirit of Yorkshire. And so that's going to be exciting in itself. And then I'm going to be presenting or hosting tastings with presenters from literally all over the world. So we have people not flying in, but they will be there hosting their portion of the tasting from the United States, from India, Sweden, and so on. So it's really, really exciting. And that's one of the great things about this, is this just wouldn't be possible in a physical event. So it's one thing that we can do differently, among others, where we can actually bring people from all over the world into this event.
Fab. And where can people find out about it? What is your URL?
So it's thewhiskylounge.com, and it is the Whiskey Festival in a Box. It's right slam on the home screen, so if you can't see it, I've done something wrong. But it's pretty obvious when you go to the homepage. We've just today put up the list of whiskies for each session. I think there's a couple still we're waiting to hear about, but we've got most of them up there. So it's looking really, really exciting, and it should be really great.
I couldn't leave Eddie without asking him where home bartenders should even start when there are so many whiskeys to choose from.
I think, and this is reflected in the whiskey industry in general, that good whiskey is now being made everywhere, all over the world. So whereas maybe 20 years ago I might have to choose a exclusively Scotch whiskey selection, I would say now I would be tempted to go with a couple of Scotches, maybe an Asian whiskey and an American whiskey. I've come to probably the opposite way around to you. I've come to American whiskey quite recently, and particularly for the book, I had to do a lot of research, which was very pleasurable. And so, I've come to really enjoy a lot of American whiskey. So I would say probably an unpeated Scotch whiskey, something like Glenmorangie 10-year-old or Glenlivet 12-year-old, which is going to be very nice, light, citrusy, aperitif style. So something I would certainly describe as a breakfast whiskey, not necessarily for breakfast, but as the first whiskey of the day. And then either something kind of medium peated, even a blended Scotch like Johnnie Walker Black Label, but I would even maybe go for something like a Springbank 10-year-old, which is a Campbelltown single malt. It's not super heavily peated like an Ardbeg or a Lagavulin. It's just got just enough just to balance out the sweetness and the natural sweetness of malt whiskey, and is a unique dram, really worth trying. And then I would maybe go for something like a Kavalan, so a Taiwanese single malt whiskey or a Japanese single malt whiskey, something like Nika Takatsuru or Kavalan Classic or Concert Master. There's so many to choose from nowadays, but basically something that has a little bit more spice and richness than the Glenmorangie or the Glenlivet. Doesn't have the peatiness of the Springbank, so it's distinctly different from those. And then in terms of the American whiskey, I would struggle between bourbon and rye because I love both. However, I think I probably drink a little bit more bourbon than I do rye. but I do quite like a bourbon that's quite rye heavy. I'm trying to think. There's a Four Roses. I can't remember if it's the small batch or the single barrel. One of those is rye heavy, and I really enjoy that. I think it might be the single barrel. And I like that because the rye for me just gives it that lovely little bit of dry spice, which sometimes bourbon can be just that little bit too sweet, but the rye just tempers that slightly, like peat in malt whiskey. So that's probably what I would go for.
Fabulous. And would you serve them neat?
I would serve the two scotches. I would serve with a jug of water as an option. Water for me is, for a lot of people, the most revelatory thing about their whiskey drinking experience, because it just brings out so much in the whiskey. Not everyone likes to do it, and I would definitely not say to anyone that they have to do it, but I would always encourage people to try it at least and just see for themselves what it can do. Similarly to the Japanese or the Taiwanese, but I would also advocate the highball, which is something I really came across in Whisky Live in Paris many years ago in the Nika archive area, which was just incredible. And I had a couple of these highballs and I was away. They were so delicious, which is essentially crushed ice, the whiskey and soda water. Very, very simple. It's whiskey's gin and tonic moment, I think. And then for the Four Roses, I would certainly either have it just with ice, a big lump of ice.
Speaking of old fashions, I feel I would be remiss if I didn't have this classic as our cocktail of the week. We could fight about how the old fashioned should be made, sugar cube versus sugar syrup. Someone once told me that in a bar in Australia, when you ordered an old-fashioned, you received a beer first because we finished drinking the beer by the time they finished stirring the old-fashioned. That's a little extreme, but I'll let the bar make it any way it wants to. But at home, I must admit, when I want my old-fashioned, I want it now. So saying that, here is our cocktail of the week made my way. Add 50 ml of bourbon to a rocks glass with one big ice cube. I'm leaving it up to you which bourbon you prefer. Then I add 2 bar spoons of Demerara sugar syrup to it, as I like mine sweet. Then 2 dashes of Angostura bitters. Then I stir, counting for 50 seconds. Voila, an old-fashioned is born. You'll find this recipe, more variations on the old-fashioned, plus all the cocktails of the week at lushlifemanual.com, where you'll find all the ingredients in the shop. Now that you're drinking an old-fashioned, close your eyes and put yourself where Eddie would love to be drinking his dram of whiskey right now. Did you know you could be endorsing old fashions wherever you went by wearing the Lush Life Old Fashioned t-shirt? More than just waving the old-fashioned flag, you are also supporting Lush Life. You can find it and loads of other cocktail emblazoned t-shirts at lushlifemanual.com/merch. Theme music for Lush Life is by Steven Shapiro and used with permission. And Lush Life is always and will be forever produced by Evo Terra and Simpler Media Productions. Which leaves me to say the wise words of Oscar Wilde: all things in moderation, including moderation. And always drink responsibly and wash your hands and stay safe. Next week, we'll be meeting the man behind Sinatra's favorite spirit and one of the most iconic brands in the world, known by its 2 famous initials, J.D. Until that time, bottoms up.